What's going on, guys? Doomwake here, and welcome back to another episode of Watching the Meta, the weekly series where we take a look at the Magic Online results over the weekend, sometimes some paper tournaments if there are large ones that do occur. I believe this week we don't have any paper tournaments, but be on the lookout for that in the future. And we take a look at the metagame of Standard, Modern, and Pioneer, the three, well, I should say the two biggest formats, although Pioneer is still a format that's near and dear to my heart, although maybe not as competitively supported by WotC anymore. But yeah, we are going to take a look at the metagame for each of those tournaments through all of the challenges, and then we'll take a look at some sweet decks that look pretty interesting. Before we get started, a quick word from our sponsor. This video is brought to you by CoolStuffInc.com. They got cool stuff, and they have it in stock. And with that out of the way, let us get started with the modern format. Well, I mean, as you can see on your screen, it's not getting any better. Now, December 14th, I think it's the 14th or the 16th, is the day that we are all waiting for as modern players. I'm going to make a video on either what I predict will happen, what I think should happen for the modern format. So be on the lookout for that in the next week or so. I do want to do like a ban list prediction video, and then we'll obviously do the live reaction when it comes out. But yeah, I mean, this is modern. If you are playing a modern tournament, this is what you're signing up for. 31% Boros energy. Not really a lot else has changed. There's some small shifts here and there. I guess Ruby Storm had a pretty good weekend. It did win 2 challenges, so that's something to keep in mind. But really not a lot of shifting happening between the different archetypes. I mean, some of the Mardu percentages went to Boros, but other than that, the modern format is what the modern format is. But outside of the Boros Energy Menace, there are some pretty sweet decks that I wanted to highlight this week. The first one that I wanted to take a look at was from Summon Legend, who narrowly missed top 8 in the 22nd challenge, and they're playing Simic Woodlands. This is a deck that I have seen some people play before. Typically, it is Teamer. I believe there's some different Cascade versions that are playing Bloodbraid Marauder, but this one is just pure Simic, and the goal is to get Delirium and Omniscience in the graveyard. So if you get Delirium, you find Shifting Woodlands, you get Omniscience in the graveyard, you then make the Woodlands a copy of Omniscience, and then it's pretty easy from there. You can cast a Karn the Great Creator, which goes and finds Ancestral Statue to bounce the Karn. The second Karn goes and gets the Aetherflux Reservoir. You can leap that infinitely. But yeah, the reason I wanted to highlight this is there is some interesting Foundations cards, not just Omniscience, as you see, that does have the Foundation symbol, Kiora the Rising Tide, which, to be fair, I think is probably the best card from Foundations for Modern, and it's a card that's kind of showing up in a lot of places. Sometimes in Blue-Black Oculus, I've seen it in Goryo's Vengeance Reanimator decks, I've seen it in now decks like this, so Kiora does seem like it is priced to move for Modern. But yeah, just wanted to highlight this one as a slightly different take on the kind of Woodlands Omniscience combo decks. And speaking of Foundations cards, coming in next in 28th place from Med the Dev, we have Leyline Axe. This is, I guess, 8 Leyline is what you could maybe call this if you so chose. But this is sort of a pump spell deck, and the reason that we are playing Leyline Axe is because they also have 4 copies of Fervent Champion, which is something that I have thought about in Pioneer when I eventually get back to playing some Pioneer. But Fervent Champion allows you to equip something for 3 less mana, which Leyline Axe costing 3 to equip. You open on Leyline Axe, you play turn 1 Fervent Champion, equip, and you have a 2/2 double strike trample. The Leyline Axe also a way to pump your creature with like stuff like Cacophony Scamp, and you have a bunch of pump spells combined with Leyline of Resonance, which doubles your pump spells. So this is sort of like the standard deck where you're casting Monstrous Rage, Mutagenic Growth, Blossoming Defense to get a double pump spell, and then just trying to kill them in one shot with Cacophony Scamp. So just an interesting take on the sort of pump spell archetype. It's like Infect adjacent. But yeah, Leyline Axe showing up in Modern as well. Speaking of Kiora, next one I got for you here is from Dragon Fodder in 30th place. This is a Grixis Lightning Skelemental deck where you are trying to utilize Kiora to dump creatures into the graveyard and then unearth them. Pretty simple stuff. You'll notice the lack of Abhorrent Oculus, which I find kind of interesting, especially if you are going out of your way to also play Unearth. I feel like that could be a good inclusion here. And you do fill up the graveyard with Stitcher Supplier and things like that. Now, it is a Namba with Nethergoyf when you exile cards from your graveyard to cast an Oculus, so I kind of understand that. Lightning Skelemental showing up here as a very good unearthed target and something you can also use with stuff like either Flare of Malice or Village Rites to be able to connect with the Skelemental, then sacrifice it to either of those. You can use Nightmare to loop the Skelementals. There's a lot of cool stuff going on here. Another really good home for Kiora. I think it makes a lot of sense in this deck. You're trying to fill up the graveyard, get Skelementals in the graveyard, and so on and so forth. So shout out to Dragon Fodder in 30th place. And last but certainly not least, from Articuno Zard, excellent username by the way, in 26th place on the 23rd challenge, we have Sultai Yigra is what I was calling this. I believe, let me know in the comment section, I believe this is initially an aspiring spike creation, where you are trying to set up the Yigra plus Cauldron Familiar, 2 Cauldron Familiar combo, which is something that people are doing a lot in Pioneer. But the cool thing about Modern is you have more cards that mill over and help you find more familiars. But what's really cool about the Modern format is you even have a card like Goryo's Vengeance to reanimate Yigra for 2 mana, so you can actually go for the combo a lot faster. And you have stuff like Buried Alive and Malevolent Rumble to help more consistently set up the combo. So really cool deck here from Articuno Zard, and that is going to do it for the Modern portion. Before we switch into Pioneer, just wanted to say the challenges were won by Dimir Oculus, Amulet Titan, Bird Scale Combo, Hardened Scales, shout out to Hardened Scales, and 2 challenges were won by Ruby Storm. With all of that out of the way, let us switch to Pioneer. Pioneer is in a bit of an interesting spot here. Again, the announcement, for those of you who haven't heard it, I believe it was right around when the World Championships happened, maybe a few weeks ago at this point, they announced that next year for RCQs, there's not going to be any Pioneer RCQs. So people are kind of left in a spot where if you enjoy the Pioneer format for what it is, because it is pretty fun and I think it is relatively diverse, the gameplay is pretty good for the most part, you don't really have a competitive outlet. Really, it's just these weekend challenges, sometimes a MOX event here or there, which there was a showcase challenge this weekend for Pioneer. And yeah, the format's kind of in a weird spot with regards to that. Now, as far as the metagame is concerned, not really a lot different, right? You see a small downtick in Rakdos Demons. Phoenix is the exact same. Company, a small downtick. Enigmatic, larger downtick. Jund Sacrifice, roughly the same. Rakdos Prowess, huge increase. Last week it was around 5%. This week it is now 11.5%, so big uptick in Rakdos Prowess. Ninjas, about the same. Nivtalite. Boros Burn, another big uptick. Last week, 3.1%. This week, 7.8%. Bolt Wave really showing up in large numbers there. A huge addition to the Pioneer format from Foundations. Lotus Field, roughly the same. And then another newcomer, which I didn't see last week, and I'm not going to highlight this deck because it is still just like mostly mono red, but mono red mice you see at the very top of your screen, only 3.1%, but it was non-existent last week. And it's sort of a different take on mono red, where instead of playing more of the prowess stuff, you're basically just transferring a lot of the standard cards, like the Mice package with Emberheart Challenger, Manifold Mouse, Heartfire Hero. You're combining that with the good red cards already in Pioneer, like Play with Fire, Kumano, things like that. So it's just a slightly different take on mono red, but I did want to make sure that it was separate from previous mono red versions. But yeah, that is the Pioneer metagame. Now, as far as sweet decks are concerned, I got 4 that I want to showcase to you guys. And what better way to start off this particular section with a username that we just saw when we were talking about Modern. Medvedev in 31st place has decided to take the Axes and the Ley Lines of Resonances and put them in their Pioneer deck. And to be honest with you, this looks really good. You have the Leyline Axe plus Fervent Champion stuff. That's, what we talked about in the Modern version. You still have a lot of the same creatures, Cacophony, Scamp, Swift Spear, and Slickshot. Your pump spells are slightly different. You're playing still Blossoming Defense, Monstrous Rage. They're playing Snakeskin Veil and Ancestral Anger, where I believe before we were playing Mutagenic Growth and Scale Up. So a little bit of a side grade or maybe a downgrade in terms of pump spells, but creatures are the same. You still have Axe, you still have Resonance, you still have good pump spells. So a pretty good place to be. This is something that I'm probably, like I said, when Pioneer Masters hits the digital shelves on Arena, I'm going to be playing a little bit more Pioneer, and the 2 cards that I want to work on the most in Pioneer are Kiora and Leyline Axe, and this is probably a good place to start if you're thinking about axing in Pioneer. Speaking of axing, it just doesn't stop here. Frantic Core in 25th place. This is one that I really had my eyes on as using Leyline Axe as an enabler for Metalwork Colossus, where Colossus gets discounted for the amount of non-creature artifacts, the total mana value of non-creature artifacts you control. You have Brass Knuckles, which copies itself, so it's the copy does retain the mana value. So if you play Brass Knuckles, you have 8 mana towards a Metalwork Colossus, so it acts as like a pseudo-ritual type thing. You have Moonsnare Prototype for mana acceleration, Simulacrum Synthesizer. So if you can chain off a bunch of Metalwork Colossus, which you can do with something like Sanctum of Ugin, you can then, say you have a Sanctum and you play Colossus, sack the Sanctum, go get another one, trigger Synthesizer, play the next Colossus, trigger Synthesizer, and you can kind of see where it pops off from here. Another really cool interaction is something that I hadn't thought about before. Chainsaw, the second ability, says whenever one or more creatures die, put a rev counter on it. So Colossus has this ability where you can sacrifice 2 artifacts to return it from your graveyard to your hand. You can sacrifice Colossus that are in play. So you can actually, if you can assemble 3 of them, you can sacrifice like 2 Metalworks to get 1 back, trigger Chainsaw. You can play the new Metalwork, sack Metalwork and something else, trigger the Chainsaw, get the other one back, and you can kind of see where that's going from there. So a deck that I am probably going to spend quite a bit of time on once we go back into Pioneer, because I love Metalwork Colossus, and I really, really think that this deck has a lot of potential. Frequent watchers of this show, or are we calling it a show? Is it officially a show? Not sure yet. Let me know in the comments. But frequent watchers of the Metagame series will probably remember this user LAA11, who continuously just keeps doing well with Fecund. How do you pronounce that? Fecund Greenshell, which is a creature that sort of pays you off for having creatures that have more toughness than their power. So I like big butts and I cannot lie, something like that. But you are playing a lot of creatures that trigger it, like Arboreal Grazer triggers it and gets you additional land. Clifftop Lookout, same thing, triggers Green Shell, finds a land. So you have a bunch of ways to hit land drops. You can eventually get to a spot where you have 10 lands in play, and then your creatures get a huge bonus from Green Shell. Now, previous versions of this deck did include clones, like Glasspool Mimic to get you more green shells and more triggers. You also had Spelunking, so the lands that you hit off of Green Shell came into play untapped to keep you going. We've decided to remove the blue in favor of a sort of Overlord package, so Overlord of the Mistmoors with Up the Beanstalk, and then we're also playing Get Lost and March for the Worldly Light. A couple of Miria's calls here as well, just kind of, slotted in the mana base, which is kind of cool. So not sure if this is necessarily a better approach than the clone version, but wanted to highlight it because LAA does a ton of work on this Fecund Green Shell deck, and this one, 13th place, not too shabby. So the last one I have for you guys is actually from the Showcase Challenge, which is a slightly more prestigious Pioneer event on Magic Online, where top 8 gets to qualify for the MOCs, and the winner of that gets to go to the MOCs Championships, Pro Tour Invite, all that stuff. But this is a Boggles deck list from T1_Tinker. But you've probably seen Boggles decks before, especially in Pioneer. You have a lot of good auras, All That Glitters, Ethereal Armor, Shard Mage's Rescue is a recent addition, as well as Sheltered by Ghosts. But none of this is the reason why I wanted to show you this list. The reason I wanted to show this list is because it's playing 4 Mox Amber, which is something I really haven't seen before. Maybe I just haven't been paying attention to Boggle lists. Let me know in the comments if this is something that you've seen before. But it makes a lot of sense because you have Lightpaws, Skrelv, and SRAM Senior Edificer. So you have 12 legends to enable the Mox Amber, and it gives you a lot of faster starts. So we're not going to spend a ton of time on this one, but if you are a Boggles enjoyer, this is probably a good place to be. And lastly, before we exit Pioneer, I just wanted to, for posterity's sake, the challenges were won by, you're not going to believe this one, Jund's Sacrifice, Izzet Phoenix, Rakdos Prowess, and then 3 of the challenges were won by 5-color Niv to Light, including the Showcase Challenge. So if you're a Niv enjoyer, might be a good time to start playing it. And last but certainly not least, we have my favorite format, probably the best format right now. Arguably, don't come at me in the comments, but I believe that Standard is just the best right now. And the metagame is sort of shifting in weird ways, right? Golgari midrange, roughly about the same. Dimir midrange, uptick 5%-ish, so it's a pretty significant uptick. What's very shocking to me, Boros Prowess. 12.5% last week, 1.9%. Now, I feel like a lot of the hype from last week with Boros Prowess was that Foundations was relatively new. People wanted to try out Boros Charm and Bolt Wave and Burst Lightning and all these new cards. And I feel like maybe they've decided that the white cards aren't where we want to be. And you'll notice in the top left, Gruul Prowess, 10% here. Last week it was in this sliver over here, which was between probably about 2%. So huge. Basically, all the numbers that got removed from Boros from last week got added to Gruul this week. So green cards appear to be on top. We'll see if that trend continues. Mono red, roughly the same. Mono white, pretty big downtick. I think that's probably because of the uptick in red decks, and maybe that matchup is not as good. I haven't played a ton of that matchup, so don't yell at me in the comments, but that could be a guess for me. Overlord's about the same. Convoke, roughly about the same. Teamer Prowess, slight uptick there. Just a slight, about 2%. Nothing too crazy. So other than that, roughly around the same. But yeah, the real big story here is the shift from Boros to Gruul, which is a little surprising because I think Boros Charm is very good. The green cards are good too, right? You have Innkeeper's Talent, Questing Druid, the Paw Patch Formation sideboard plan. So there is a lot of good green cards. But that is what the metagame is looking like this week. Now, I got 6 decks that I wanted to showcase to you guys, and they're all pretty sweet. The first one I have for you, now we're not going to spend too much time on this because a lot of what you see here is probably what you would expect from an Oculus deck. The one thing I wanted to shout out and note from Zork Meat in 29th place here is the introduction of green for Say Its Name and Altenac the Thrice Called. So Say Its Name is a way to mill over cards. You can get permanents back with Say Its Name. You can get a creature or land card, rather, excuse me. So you actually don't have a lot of hits for Say Its Name, right? You only have 15 creatures and 20 lands. All of your instants and sorceries are not hits. So that's kind of a big downside. But the upside to Say Its Name is you get an additional threat in the form of Altenac Thrice Called, where if you can mill over or put 3 Say Its Names in the graveyard by some means, whether discarding or milling over, then you can use that to go get a huge 9/9 trample. Now, I really don't know if it's worth splashing. Like, you do have to make your mana base a little bit worse by adding Yavimaya Coast and Botanical Sanctum. So keep that in mind, but just an interesting, slightly different take on the blue-white Oculus deck. Next one I got for you is actually from the top 8 of, I believe it was the Saturday Challenge, Matsu Casa 10 in 7th place here. Now, this deck is really sweet, and when you get to do the thing, it is really, really cool. Can confirm, I did play this deck live on stream yesterday. Now, I'm not sure if the video is going to be going up because it didn't go very well, but the idea here is Urbrask is a card that says whenever you cast an instant or sorcery spell, you add a red mana and deal your opponent a damage. You combine that with Artist Talent, which is level 2, non-creature spells you cast cost 1 less to play. So you have cost reducer, card that generates mana. You can kind of see where this is going. A lot of your other cards are, well, your burn spells, Burst Lightning, Lightning Strike, and Shock, and then your other cards are just ways that are like 2 mana cards that effectively draw cards. Ren's Resolve, Highway Robbery, Hearth Elemental, and Questing Druid all have some sort of ability as a sorcery, 2 mana, draw some number of cards. So the idea is that if you get the Urbrask and the Artist Talent both in play, every time you're spending 1 mana on your draw 2, you're generating the mana back from the Urbrask, and that just lets you keep churning through your whole. You basically just like machine gun through your whole deck. Now that sounds cool and all. The problem is you usually can't win if you don't assemble Urbrask plus talent. So it's a little difficult. Their deck that dies to Doomblade, deck that dies to Disenchant. It's a little risky. But I will say, if you get to do the combo, it is a lot of fun. So I would recommend giving this one a try, but don't put all your eggs in one basket. Next up, from Nyctophobia in 26th place, we have this kind of red-green ramp deck. Now, you may have, if you've been following Standard over the past couple of weeks, you may have seen something like this before. Usually, they contain the card Smuggler's Surprise, which, looking in the instance over here, where'd they go? I don't see any. Interesting take on the Gruul ramp archetype that's kind of focusing more on the 3-drops rather than going all the way up the curve and playing Calamity with Smuggler's Surprise, and we're not going that high up on the curve. Rather, we are playing more powerful 3-drops, notably Screaming Nemesis, which I think looks out of place in this deck because it is trying to go over the top of other people with Hot Woods, Boiler Bilges, Roxanne, stuff like that. But if you just go turn 1 Elf, turn 2 Screaming Nemesis, on the play, you're in a commanding position already without even doing much else. And the really cool thing I like about this is the introduction of Bushwhack, which looks pretty marginal, right? Just as a 1 mana way to search for a land. But if you're playing with 4 Screaming Nemesis, you can use the Nemesis to fight your opponent's creature and either deal them a bunch of damage or make it so they can't gain life for the rest of the game. So really, really interesting take on the Gruul ramp archetype, kind of just lowering the curve a little bit, and I think that's a really good place to be. Well, we saw Boggles in Pioneer, so why not take a look at them in Standard? From user Traft in 30th place, we have Armored Armadillo Boggles. Now, side note, you won't see any Glade Cover Scouts here. The creatures that we have to play, as you can see by the card that I've highlighted on your screen, are a little less than stellar. We are playing 1 mana O4s in our deck, but the upside is that we're using a lot of really good enchantment synergy. Specifically, the card that I think is the most impressive to me is Optimistic Scavenger, where every time you have an enchantment come into play, you get a counter on something. You have Toadstool Admirer, which does a Glade Cover Scout impression with Ward 2. It's hard to kill early. And then you do have some protection as well. You have 3 Royal Treatment and 4 Shard Mage's Rescue alongside Ethereal Armor, Audacity, Sheltered by Ghosts, kind of like the good auras, as you will. So yeah, I don't know, interesting. Again, the creatures you have to play to make a green-white Boggles deck playable are kind of so I'm a little skeptical. But really, Sheltered by Ghosts is maybe good enough to carry. Next up, from Emperor Opie, 32nd place, we have Mono Black Reanimator. Now, we've seen some Reanimator decks before. We've seen Rakdos, we've seen Dimir, we've seen Esper. But what I like about this is the simplicity of it. Just clean mana base. The other cool thing about playing Mono Black is you get to play more copies of Soulstone Sanctuary, which in turn makes Annex better, which in turn makes you want more demons. And what's really cool about Abyssal Harvester, it's not just a demon for Unholy Annex, it also is a way to reanimate something. So if you have a Harvester in play, and you say on turn 4, after you've untapped with your Harvester, you go Bitter Triumph, discard my Valgavoth Terror Eater to kill your creature, your Abyssal Harvester can just reanimate your Valgavoth, which is pretty cool, utilizing Harvester as not just a demon, which I was doing in Golgari. For Annex, it's also our secondary reanimation spell. So really cool take on the Reanimator archetype. Flesh Gorger is another cool one where you can cast it for 3 mana, or you can reanimate it and get a big 7 mana 7/5. So cool take on the Reanimator archetype. And last but certainly not least, from Bad Gods, this is the Showcase Qualifier. 4th place, so top 8, with 8 crabs, or 8 terrors, 8 serpents. They're both water creatures. I don't know. Let me know in the comments what would be a good deck name for this deck. And for Twitch viewers, don't use the one that we use on Twitch. But in any case, it's hard to describe this deck, where you have some self-mill, you have cash grab to mill over cards, a bunch of cantrips, like you have Sleight of Hand, Bushwhack to find lands, Analyze to find lands, Seed of Hope to mill, Into the Floodmaw unsummoned for cheap bounce spell. So you have ways to fill up the graveyard with instants and sorceries to then make your crabs and terrors cost less mana. You also have Up the Beanstalk, which triggers off of Crab and Terror, but more importantly, triggers off of This Town Ain't Big Enough. So this deck is sort of utilizing the synergy between Storm Chaser's talent, This Town Ain't Big Enough, and Up the Beanstalk in a similar way to the Temur Otters deck, but rather than have a combo finish, it's just utilizing the advantage to kind of push its advantage further by casting large creatures like Eddie Mercrab, Tolarian Terror, bunch of bounce spells to buy you time, Into the Floodmaw, unsummon. And to be quite honest with you, I think this deck is fantastic. I think you kind of beat the crap out of the mid-range decks. You go over the top of them without having to play a bunch of clunky cards like Domain. And the problem is the red matchup, which I don't think is very good. But sometimes you can steal games where you have a fast crab, you tap their attackers, you can try to race them with multiple terrors. It is possible. But I do like this deck quite a bit, and the really cool thing about this deck, it's pretty budget friendly. Like, if you look at this, besides the mana base, there's not really anything here that's worth more than an uncommon. So really good deck, really budget friendly. And before I let you guys go, I just wanted to mention there was four regular challenges, 1 showcase, were won by Gruul Prowess, Golgari Midrange, Dimir Midrange, 2 mono red. One of the mono red was the showcase winner. And that puts a wrap on another episode of Watching the Meta. I hope you guys enjoyed the content. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know in the comment section below what is your favorite deck of the ones we showcased this week. Subscribe to the channel if you are enjoying the content. And until next week, adios.